The first sensation was the silk. Not the cool, smooth slide of it under her fingers as she worked, but a brutal, burning pressure around her throat. It was the scarf, the deep crimson one she had woven herself from the finest, strongest mulberry silk. He was using her own art to steal her breath. Soraya's eyes flew open, not to the terrifying, fading view of her studio's timbered ceiling from the floor, but to the soft, sun-dappled linen of her pillowcase. She gasped, a raw, ragged sound that tore at her throat, which felt inexplicably whole and unmarked. Her hands flew to her neck, patting smooth, unbroken skin. No pain, no bruising, just the frantic hammering of her pulse beneath her fingertips. She sat up too quickly, the world tilting. This was her room. Their bedroom in the quiet, sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city of Viridia. Morning light streamed through the large bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was peaceful. It was wrong. The memories crashed over her in a nauseating wave. Julian, his face, usually so perfectly composed, twisted into a mask of vicious intent. His hands, strong from stretching canvases, but never from real labor, pulling the ends of the scarf. The sound of her own gurgling pleas, choked off into nothing. The final, chilling words he had hissed into her ear. Asterisk, a masterpiece should be unique. You understand, don't you, my love? You've become a duplicate. Asterisk, he had killed her. Her husband, the man she had built her life and career around, had murdered her because she had discovered the truth. For years, she had believed in their partnership. She, the reclusive genius weaver hidden away in her studio, creating breathtaking, unique textiles. He, the charismatic frontman, the visionary designer who presented her work to the world. But he had no vision of his own. He was a hollow man, and he had been feeding her designs to Isolde. Isolde. The name was a shard of ice in her heart. A sleek, socially brilliant rising star in the fashion world. Soraya had found the sketches, her sketches, with Julian's notes in the margin about how Isolde should present them as her own inspiration. The planned Verve collection was nothing but a gallery of Soraya's stolen ghosts. And when she had confronted him, he had decided she was a liability, an original that needed to be destroyed to protect the forgeries. A sob caught in her throat, but she swallowed it down, clenching her fists in the soft duvet. The fabric was real. The sunlight was real. The scent of beeswax and lavender from the hallway was real. This was no dying dream. Somehow, impossibly, she was back. Soraya? Julian's voice, smooth as warmed honey, called from the doorway. Are you unwell? I heard a cry. She froze, every muscle locking. She couldn't look at him. Not yet. If she saw his face, the face that had been the last thing she saw in one life and was now the first thing in the second, twisted chance, she would scream. Or vomit. Or launch herself at him, with nails bared. She focused on her breathing, on the feeling of air filling her lungs, a sensation she had never thought to appreciate until it was stolen. She forced her shoulders to relax, her hands to unclench. She had been a master weaver for a decade. She knew the value of patience, of tension carefully controlled. She could play this thread. A nightmare, she managed, her voice slightly hoarse. She cleared it. Just a very bad dream. Julian stepped into the room, and she risked a glance. He was as beautiful as ever, with his artfully tousled dark hair and chiseled features. He wore a silk robe, a deep blue that made his eyes seem warmer than they were. He looked at her with a facade of concern, but she could see the impatience lurking just beneath the surface. He had always been impatient with what he called her melodramatic sensitivities. You work too hard, my dear, he said, coming to sit on the edge of the bed. He reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, and she had to suppress a flinch. His touch felt like a spider's crawl. It's the creative mind. It never rests. Which is why, he continued, his tone brightening into the one he used when unveiling a new scheme, we need to talk about our next project. I had an epiphany last night. This was it. The moment. In her first life, this was the day he had first whispered the words, Master Collection. The project that would be her glory and, ultimately, her coffin. An epiphany? She echoed, keeping her voice neutral, tilting her head as if in curiosity. Yes. His eyes gleamed with a possessive light. We've been playing at the edges, Soraya. Your textiles in my designs. It's been successful, but it's time to consolidate. To create a legacy. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I propose we create a single, definitive master collection. A full spectrum of your most brilliant work, from gowns to tapestries, all under our shared name. We'll present it as the culmination of our partnership. Asterisk our shared name. Asterisk the lie was so audacious it took her breath away all over again. In reality, it would be her hands, her genius, creating the work, and his name alone on the placards. He would use the collection's success to finally push her out of the picture, elevating Isolde to her place. He had said as much in the end. In her first life, she had been hesitant. The scale was daunting, and she had felt a vague unease about merging their identities so completely. Her caution had annoyed him, had been the first crack in their facade that eventually widened into a chasm. She would not be cautious this time. She would be the one to weave the trap, and he would be the fly. She let a slow smile spread across her face, a careful imitation of the adoring wife she had once been. She reached out and placed her hand over his, fighting the revulsion that rose in her throat. Julian, she said, her voice filled with manufactured awe. That's a magnificent idea. A true legacy. Our masterpiece. The change in him was instantaneous. The impatience vanished, replaced by triumphant satisfaction. He squeezed her hand. I knew you would understand. You're the only one who ever truly sees my vision. Oh, I see it, she thought, her mind already racing, calculating. Asterisk I see it more clearly than you ever could. I see the greed, the theft, and the murder at the end of the road. Asterisk, of course, she murmured, her smile not reaching her eyes. Let's do it. Let's create our master collection. He kissed her forehead, a dry, possessive press of lips, and stood, already talking of contracts and gallery shows and investors. Soraya listened, nodding in all the right places, but her mind was elsewhere. It was in the studio with the looms and the silks and the dyes. It was with the fragile, proprietary crimson thread she had been developing in secret, the one that reacted to heat and moisture. The thread that could make a masterpiece unravel before the world's eyes. Julian had given her the spool. Now, she would begin to weave. The Vermilion Gallery was a beast of glass and steel, a pulsating heart in the cultural district of Viridia. Tonight, it was filled with the city's elite, critics with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, socialites draped in labels, and patrons whose wealth was as quiet as it was vast. It was Julian's natural habitat, a stage where he performed the role of the tormented, brilliant artist to perfection. Soraya stood beside him, a silent accessory in a sea of noise. She wore a gown of her own making, a shift of midnight blue velvet so deep it seemed to drink the light, embroidered with a subtle, almost hidden pattern of silver threads that mimicked a star-strewn sky. It was a piece that whispered of skill, not shouted. Julian, by contrast, was a symphony in burgundy and black, drawing every eye. He held her arm possessively, his grip just a little too tight. A reminder, she knew, to play her part. The dutiful, reclusive wife. The silent wellspring of his inspiration. Remember, he murmured, his smile never wavering as he nodded at a passing gallery owner. Tonight is about vision. Our future. Your future, she thought, asterisk, built on my past. Asterisk, but she merely inclined her head, a delicate gesture she had practiced to convey shy agreement. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and champagne. Soraya's senses, heightened by the trauma of her death and rebirth, felt assaulted. The clinking glasses were like shattering crystal, the laughter a jarring cacophony. She felt the ghost of the silk scarf around her neck and had to consciously steady her breathing. Julian, darling, a voice cut through the din. Isolde. She moved through the crowd like a sleek predator, a vision in blood-orange silk that clung to her every curve. Her dress was a blatant, provocative design, one of Julian's early, clumsy attempts at copying Soraya's style before he had learned to mimic her subtlety. Isolde's gaze swept over Soraya with the barest acknowledgement before locking onto Julian, a knowing, intimate smile playing on her lips. The show is a triumph, Isolde purred, linking her arm with Julian's as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Soraya's grip on her champagne flute tightened. Everyone is talking about the narrative depth in your new pieces. She let out a light, tinkling laugh. If only they knew the real depth comes from being locked away in a studio. The barb was aimed at Soraya, disguised as a compliment to Julian. In her first life, it would have stung, making her feel like a ghost in her own story. Now, it was just another thread in the ugly tapestry they were weaving. Genius requires solitude, Isolde. Julian replied smoothly, his eyes meeting hers in a shared joke. Not all of us can thrive in the spotlight. Perhaps some of us simply have more to show in it, Isolde countered, her gaze flicking to Soraya once more, dismissive and cool. It was then that Julian guided them both toward a small, raised platform at the center of the gallery. A hush fell over the crowd. This was the moment Soraya had been dreading and anticipating. The loom of their deception was about to be strung with its first, public thread. Friends, colleagues, Julian began, his voice projecting warmth and authority. Thank you for celebrating this prelude with me tonight. He spoke of art, of the struggle to give form to feeling, of the loneliness of creation. He was a master orator, and the crowd was captivated. Soraya watched him, seeing the performance for what it was, a beautifully crafted lie. But true art, he continued, his tone deepening, is not a solitary pursuit. It is a conversation, a partnership. He reached out, and his hand found Soraya's, pulling her gently into the circle of light with him. She felt every eye upon her, a wave of scrutiny that made her skin crawl. For years, my wife, Soraya, has been my silent partner. Her hands, her spirit, are in every fiber of the work you see here. There was a murmur of surprise and appreciation. Soraya kept her expression soft, a little overwhelmed, the picture of wifely devotion. Inside, her mind was a cold, clear lake. And it is that partnership I wish to honor, to elevate, to immortalize, Julian declared, his voice rising with passion. I am here tonight to announce our most ambitious project yet. A definitive statement. A single, cohesive body of work that will be the culmination of everything we are. We will call it the Master Collection. A ripple of excitement went through the crowd. Cameras flashed. It will be everything, he said, his eyes sweeping over his audience. Gowns that are moving sculptures. Tapestries that tell epic stories. All created by our joined hands, bearing our shared name. It will be our legacy. His legacy. Built on her labor. The theft was so brazen, so public, it was almost admirable in its audacity. He was officially claiming co-authorship of her life's work, retroactively and for the future, before he even discarded her. In her first life, this had been the moment her stomach had clenched with unease. She had felt exposed, uncomfortable with the scale and the presumption. She had later expressed her reservations to Julian in private, a hesitation he had used to paint her as unsupportive, as afraid of true greatness. This time, she would give him no such ammunition. As the applause began to swell, Julian turned to her, his face a mask of expectant pride. My love, would you like to say a few words? It was a test, a courtesy he never expected her to take. The Soraya of before would have shrunk from the attention, muttering a shy no. Thank you. This Soraya met his gaze. She saw the faintest flicker of surprise in his eyes as she did not immediately look away. She then turned to the crowd, a gentle, serene smile gracing her lips. She let the silence hang for a beat, drawing them in. Thank you, Julian, she said, her voice clear and carrying, though she pitched it softly. For your vision. For believing in us. She paused, looking down as if gathering emotion, before lifting her eyes again, letting them shine with what she hoped looked like unshed tears of joy. This collection, this master collection, it's a dream I never dared to voice. To create something so profound, so lasting. With the man I love, it is the greatest gift. She reached for Julian's hand and squeezed it, her touch firm. I am so proud to walk this path with you. Let's create our masterpiece. The applause that followed was deafening. It was warmer, more genuine than the polite clapping for Julian's speech. They were charmed. The story of the brilliant, reclusive artist and her visionary husband, united in love and art, was simply too perfect. Julian's smile was brilliant, but as he leaned in to kiss her cheek, she felt the tension in his jaw. He was pleased but also thrown. This was not the script. She was not behaving like his quiet, predictable mouse. As they stepped down from the platform, Isolde was there, her smile brittle. How touching, she said, her voice a low hiss meant only for them. A true collaboration. I can't wait to see what you both come up with. You'll be the first to know, Isolde, Soraya replied, her smile never faltering. After all, you've always been so supportive of Julian's work. She saw the flash of anger in Isolde's eyes before the woman masked it with a tight smile and melted back into the crowd. Julian guided her away, his hand on the small of her back. "You are magnificent," he whispered, but his voice held a questioning note. "I didn't know you had such a talent for public speaking." "I was inspired," Soraya said simply, looking at the throng of people, at the world that was his domain. She had just taken her first small step into it. She had agreed to the collection. She had publicly embraced the trap. Now, hidden from view, she would begin to build the mechanism that would spring it. The master collection would be her masterpiece, indeed. A masterpiece of revenge, woven from threads of deception, greed, and a crimson silk that knew how to die. The days following the gallery show were a study in controlled duplicity. Soraya moved through the sprawling estate like a ghost, performing the rituals of her old life with a new, chilling precision. She smiled at Julian over breakfast, discussing color palettes and fabric weights. She nodded as he spoke of investors and timelines, her mind a million miles away, cataloging his every lie. Her studio, once a sanctuary, was now a war room. Sunlight still streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing above her looms. The scent of raw silk, beeswax, and dye remained, but the air was now charged with a new purpose. The first and most crucial battle of this war was to establish irrefutable proof of ownership. In her previous life, her creativity had been its own record. She had never imagined needing to defend it from the very person who claimed to champion it. That naivete had killed her. No more. She began with the Weaver's Ledger. It was not a single book, but a system. She purchased a beautiful, leather-bound journal, but its contents were cryptic, personal reflections, poetic musings on light and texture. The true ledger was digital, stored on an encrypted drive she kept hidden inside a hollowed-out bobbin of common thread. Every design, from the most complex tapestry cartoon to the simplest embroidery motif, was meticulously photographed and dated. She included process shots, the warp stretched on the loom, the half-finished weft, the raw materials with their purchase receipts. She documented the creation of the crimson thread, her secret weapon, recording its chemical composition and the specific, fragile bonding agent she had developed. Next, she needed to see the enemy's camp. Julian was careful, but he was also arrogant. He believed her to be trusting and technologically inept. One afternoon, while he was distracted on a long call, praising his own genius to a potential backer, she approached his study. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet house. She slipped a tiny, wireless tracking software onto his personal tablet, a device he used for his private communications, believing it secure from the prying eyes of the estate's main network. The program, procured through a shadowy online contact and paid for with cryptocurrency from a secret account, would mirror his activity to a secure server only she could access. The information that began to flow was a torrent of cold validation. There were the designs. Her designs. Photographs of her own sketchbooks, taken stealthily in her studio, sent to an encrypted chat. Julian's messages to Isolde were a litany of betrayal. Asterisk, see this one, my darling? The Starlight Vortex. Soraya just finished the sample. It's exquisite. It will be the centerpiece of your gown for the Atherton ball. Asterisk, asterisk, she's calling this one Whispering Willow. Dreadfully pastoral, but the texture is revolutionary. We'll present it as your groundbreaking new technique. Asterisk, asterisk, be patient. The master collection will be the final harvest. Once it's launched and the contracts are signed, her usefulness ends. The world will see you as my true collaborator, the face of a new era. She's just the hands. Asterisk, Soraya read these messages with a detached calm that surprised her. The pain was there, a dull, old ache, but it was buried under layers of icy resolve. This was no longer about a broken heart. It was about survival and justice. The digital trail led her to a physical location, a chic apartment in the city's old merchant quarter, a place called the Spire. It was Isolde's official residence, but the rent, she discovered through a cross-referenced financial document, was paid from a shell company that traced back to Julian. Using the funds she had slowly been siphoning from a private savings account her family had left her, money Julian had never known about, she hired a man named Kale. Kale was not a private investigator in the traditional sense. He was a discreet security consultant, a man who operated in the gray spaces of Viridia's underworld. He met her in a quiet, backroom booth of a tea shop that smelled of damp wool and black tea. He had a calm, unremarkable face and eyes that missed nothing. Your husband and the woman, Isolde, he confirmed without preamble, sliding a slim folder across the table. They used the apartment as a base of operations. He visits 3 times a week, often for several hours. The doorman is paid to be blind. Inside were photographs. Julian and Isolde entering the building, his hand on the small of her back. Blown-up images from a long-lens camera through a window. Isolde, wearing a robe, holding up one of Soraya's textile samples against herself while Julian watched, a glass of wine in his hand, a possessive smile on his face. They were not just business partners. The intimacy was palpable, a mockery of her marriage. But the most damning evidence was financial. Cale had unearthed the Cayman Islands account. Julian had been funneling money for years, advances from galleries, payments from private clients, into this hidden coffer. The money that was meant to sustain their life, to fund her materials, was being hoarded to build a new life with Isolde, funded by the corpse of her art. Sitting in her studio that night, Soraya felt a strange sense of peace. The horror was no longer a nebulous fear. It was documented, quantified, and stored in multiple secure locations. She held the hollow bobbin in her hand, feeling the slight weight of the drive within. She had the ledger. She had the messages. She had the photographs. She had the bank records. She was no longer the victim of a plot. She was the archivist of their crime. Walking to a large chest, she unlocked a hidden compartment at its base. Inside, nestled in raw silk, were spools of her crimson thread. It looked ordinary, a simple, rich red. But she knew its secret. She picked one up, feeling the slight, almost greasy texture of the bonding agent. The master collection would be the most beautiful work of her life. Every piece would be a testament to her skill, a lure for Julian's greed. And woven into the heart of each one, invisible to the eye, would be this thread. The thread of their undoing. She had found the hidden pattern of their deception. Now, she would begin to weave her own. The following weeks were a masterclass in performance. Soraya became the artist Julian had always pretended she wasn't, not just in skill, but in the art of deception. She draped herself in the cloak of the devoted, inspired wife, and she wore it so perfectly that even Julian's sharp, suspicious nature was soothed into complacency. She began the master collection with a fervor that delighted him. The great loom in her studio hummed from dawn until deep into the night. She let him see her passion, her absorption. She asked his opinion on shades of azure and emerald, feigning deep consideration of his vapid suggestions about emotional resonance and market appeal. She was weaving his ego into the very fabric of the project, making him feel like a true collaborator, the architect of this grand endeavor. "Your energy is transformative, Soraya," Julian remarked one evening, watching her as she carefully wound a new warp onto the beam. He stood in her studio doorway, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, a king surveying his most productive subject. "This collection. It will change everything." "It already has," she replied without looking up, her fingers flying, tying off threads with precise, practiced knots. She meant it, though not in the way he assumed. The collection had given her a purpose far beyond art, the purpose of survival. This was the second, more delicate phase of her plan, the incorporation of the golden thread, or rather, the crimson one. It was a process of immense risk. She had to embed the fragile, proprietary thread into the pieces in such a way that it was structurally critical, yet visually indistinguishable. It had to bear the weight of the fabric, the stress of wear, until the precise moment it was meant to fail. She started with the foundational pieces. A sweeping evening gown, intended to be the collection's opener, was based on a technique she called liquid metal. It involved weaving fine silver-gilt threads with a base of sheer, smoky gauze. Into the core of every major structural seam, the shoulders, the waist, the cascading train, she plied her crimson thread. To any observer, it was merely a deeper red shade in the complex color palette. Only she knew it was the skeleton key that would unlock the gown's destruction. Next was a tapestry, a vast landscape of a mythical forest. The trees were woven with countless threads of green, brown, and gold. She integrated the crimson thread into the central, ancient oak, the focal point of the piece. It formed the main trunk and the largest branches. The tapestry would be stunning, a testament to her skill, until heat and moisture targeted that central core, causing the great tree to dissolve and the entire forest to collapse in on itself. The work was painstaking. Every insertion was a calculated risk. She had to ensure the bonding agent wouldn't degrade prematurely from the ambient humidity of her studio or the heat of her own hands. She conducted secret tests in a locked storage closet, timing how long it took for samples to disintegrate under a focused stream of warm, moist air. She was an artist turned chemist turned saboteur. Julian, emboldened by her compliance and the rapid progress, grew more audacious. He began bringing Isolde to the estate. "The master collection needs a muse," he announced one afternoon, sweeping into the studio with Isolde trailing behind him like a beautiful shadow. And who better than Isolde? She embodies the modern elegance we're striving for. Soraya looked up from her loom, her hands never ceasing their rhythmic dance. She offered a small, polite smile. "Of course. Welcome, Isolde." Isolde prowled the perimeter of the studio, her fingertips brushing against hanging swatches of fabric. Her eyes were not those of an admirer, but of an assessor, a thief taking inventory. "This is quaint," Isolde said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I always imagined a genius's studio would be more chaotic. This is just so orderly." "It's the order that allows for chaos to emerge in the work," Soraya replied calmly, her gaze fixed on the intricate pattern growing under her fingers. "Without a strong warp, the weft has nothing to hold on to. It all falls apart." Isolde's smile was thin. How very philosophical. She stopped behind Soraya, looking over her shoulder. "What is this one?" "A concept for the finale gown," Soraya said, not breaking her rhythm. "I'm calling it Ethel's Promise." "It's bold," Julian interjected, moving to stand beside Isolde. "But perhaps the neckline is too severe. Isolde has a more delicate collarbone. It should be softened, to frame her features." Asterisk her features. Asterisk the words hung in the air, a blatant confession. Soraya simply nodded. "I'll take it under advisement." She would do no such thing. Every stitch, every thread, was part of her design now. His suggestions were the meaningless buzzing of a fly caught in the web. She watched them from the corner of her eye. Julian would point to a detail, and Isolde would lean in, her head close to his, whispering comments that made him smile. They were a unit, a pair of conspirators standing in the heart of the kingdom they planned to plunder. They believed she was the dutiful worker bee, too absorbed in her honeycomb to notice the vulture circling. What they didn't see was the cold, clinical focus behind her eyes. They didn't see her cataloging their every interaction, the casual touches, the shared glances. They didn't see her noting the exact moments when Julian's criticism of her work aligned perfectly with a subtle gesture from Isolde. The greatest performance was her silence. She swallowed their insults disguised as advice, their plans disguised as collaboration. She poured all the fury, the betrayal, the memory of a silk scarf tightening around her throat, into the work. Every pass of the shuttle, every beat of the weft, was infused with her resolve. The master collection grew, piece by beautiful, treacherous piece. To Julian and Isolde, it was a monument to their future triumph. To Soraya, it was a gilded cage she was building around them, and the crimson thread was the key she would turn in the lock. She was the weaver at the loom, patient and precise. And she was watching the golden threads of their arrogance and greed weave themselves perfectly into the pattern of their own ruin. The final stitch was placed on Ethel's Promise, with the quiet precision of a surgeon closing a wound. Soraya stepped back from the mannequin, her body aching with a fatigue that was both physical and spiritual. The gown was a masterpiece, a sinister echo of her own bridal wear, woven from shadows and starlight. And deep within its core, the crimson thread lay in wait. It was then that Julian's strategy shifted. The collaborative mask slipped, revealing the jailer beneath. "The collection is nearly complete," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier false warmth. He stood in her studio doorway, not as a visitor, but as a warden. "The pressure now is immense. The investors, the gallery. They need assurance that the creative flow is uninterrupted." He gestured vaguely towards the windows, the sprawling gardens beyond. "The outside world is a distraction. The noise of the city, the trivial demands of daily life. They drain the creative spirit. To ensure the final pieces meet my vision, I think it's best if you remain here at the estate until the unveiling." Soraya's blood ran cold, though she had expected this. "Remain here? You mean not leave at all?" "For your own focus, my dear," he said, his tone slick with false concern. "And for security. The designs are too valuable. We can't have any risks. I've arranged for all your needs to be met. Anything you require, you simply tell Mrs. Albright, and she will procure it." Mrs. Albright, the stern, loyal housekeeper whose eyes held a quiet disapproval of Soraya's idleness, was to be her guard. The estate, with its high walls and electronic gates, was to be her prison. The gilded cage was being locked. In her first life, this had been a moment of claustrophobic panic, a feeling of being smothered. She had protested, which had only given Julian the excuse to paint her as emotionally unstable, too fragile for the pressures of their grand project. This time, she simply nodded, her expression one of weary acceptance. "You're right," she murmured, letting her shoulders slump slightly. "The final details require all my concentration. The outside world. It does feel loud." Julian's smile was a flash of triumph. He had been prepared for a fight. Her acquiescence was a victory he savored. "I knew you would understand.
This is for the best.
For both of us." The isolation was enforced with swift, silent efficiency. Her personal car was sent for servicing. The landline in her studio was disconnected, leaving only the main house line, monitored by Mrs.
Albright.
Julian took her phone, claiming the constant notifications from galleries and admirers were a distraction she didn't need. She was cut off, utterly dependent. But Soraya was prepared. In the sole of her house slipper was a cheap, prepaid burner phone, its number known only to Kale, the discreet investigator. It was her tether to the outside world, her secret shuttle passing through the bars of her cage. She played her part perfectly. She became a phantom in her own home, drifting from her studio to her room and back again. She ate the meals brought to her on a tray. She offered meek smiles to Mrs. Albright. She presented each finished piece to Julian with a show of submissive pride. When he brought Isolde for another fitting, Soraya did not flinch. She stood silently as Isolde preened before the mirror in a jacket woven with threads of gold and silver, a piece Soraya had secretly named Fool's Gold. "It fits as if it were made for me," Isolde purred, turning to Julian, ignoring Soraya completely. "It was," Julian replied, his gaze possessive. "It's all for you, my love."
Soon.
They spoke as if she weren't there, a piece of furniture. Their audacity was a weapon, but she let it glance off the armor of her knowledge. She was not the prisoner here. She was the architect. Their comfort in her presence was their weakness. Alone in her studio at night, the estate silent around her, she would activate the burner phone. Kale's reports were succinct. *, the narrative is being set. Interviews placed in Viridia Vogue and The Canvas. Julian speaks of your sensitive temperament, your need for protected solitude, to nurture your shared genius. He is the devoted husband, shielding his fragile wife. *, financial moves detected. Large transfers from the main business account to the Cayman holding. He is preparing for the launch. Isolde has been measured for the finale gown.
Your design.
Each message was a piece of the puzzle, confirming the path. They were writing the story of her irrelevance, her instability, setting the stage to push her out once the collection had served its purpose. They thought they were building their future. In reality, they were fortifying the walls of the trap she had built for them. She walked to the chest and lifted out the final spool of crimson thread. It felt heavier than the others, laden with the weight of what was to come. She would weave it into the finale gown, the piece Isolde would wear, the centerpiece of their triumph. The cage was gilded, yes. But Soraya was not the songbird trapped inside. She was the one who had built it, and she held the only key. The silence of the estate was no longer oppressive. It was the quiet before the storm. And she was the gathering cloud. The Ethelgard Hall was a temple to modern opulence, all polished black marble and soaring glass that reflected the glittering crowd within. Tonight, it was the epicenter of Viridia's art world, a humming hive of anticipation. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the clinking of champagne flutes and the low, excited murmur of hundreds of voices. For them, it was a social event. For Soraya, it was the anvil upon which her revenge would be forged. Julian had orchestrated her arrival with the precision of a stage manager. She was brought in through a private entrance, shielded from the press, and installed in a secluded balcony box shrouded in velvet shadows. It was the perfect vantage point. She could see everything, while remaining largely invisible herself. The narrative, she knew, was that the reclusive, fragile artist was observing from a safe distance. In reality, she was a general surveying the battlefield. From her perch, she watched Julian work the room. He was magnetic, a symphony in a tailored black tuxedo, his laughter ringing out, his hands gesturing gracefully as he held court. He was the maestro, and the crowd was his orchestra. Isolde was his perfect counterpoint, a vision in a slinky, sapphire blue gown that was not from the collection, a deliberate choice to ensure all eyes would be on the main event. She clung to his arm, her smile radiant and proprietary, already playing the part of the muse-turned-co-creator. The collection itself was displayed on a series of rotating, illuminated platforms in the center of the hall. The liquid metal gown shimmered under the lights, the whispering willow tapestry seemed to sway in an unseen breeze, and the fool's gold jacket glinted with deceptive promise. The crowd pressed close, their faces masks of awe and envy. Soraya saw critics nodding, patrons calculating bids, and socialites burning with a desire to possess these pieces. They were witnessing what they believed was the pinnacle of Julian's, and by grudging association, her career. They had no idea they were looking at beautifully wrapped explosives. Her gaze was drawn to the finale platform, currently veiled by a floor-to-ceiling black curtain. Behind it was Ethel's promise, the gown Isolde would wear for the culminating walk. Soraya's fingers tightened on the velvet railing of her box. Every thread, every hidden strand of crimson, was in place. A sudden hush fell over the crowd as Julian, with Isolde on his arm, ascended the central dais. A spotlight pinned them, two brilliant moths against the dark. "My friends," Julian's voice, amplified, filled the vast space, smooth and commanding. "Thank you for sharing this night with us. What you see here," he gestured expansively to the collection, "is more than art. It is a testament to vision, to perseverance, to the belief that beauty can be a transformative force." He spoke of struggle, of late nights, of the relentless pursuit of perfection. He spoke as if he had personally wrestled every thread onto the loom. Soraya listened, her face a placid mask, while inside, a cold fury burned. His theft was not just of her work, but of her struggle, her passion, her very soul poured into the fabric. "And this vision," he continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate, conspiratorial tone, "requires not just a creator, but an interpreter, a muse who breathes life into the form." He turned to Isolde, his smile blinding. "Isolde has been the heart of this collection. Her spirit, her essence, is woven into its very core." The crowd applauded. Isolde basked in the adulation, her eyes shining with triumph and tears. This was her coronation. "And now," Julian announced, his voice rising again with theatrical flourish, "the piece that embodies it all, the promise of a new dawn. I give you the finale of the Master Collection." With a dramatic sweep of his arm, the black curtain fell. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Ethel's promise was even more stunning under the stark show lights. The gown was a paradox of shadow and illumination, seeming to drink the light in one moment and radiate it in the next. It was terrifyingly beautiful. Isolde, with a final, glowing look at Julian, descended from the dais and moved towards the gown. A team of attendants, prepped for this moment, carefully helped her into it. The fabric sighed as it settled over her frame, a perfect, sinister fit. She looked ethereal, deadly, a goddess of ruin. As the attendants fastened the final clasp, Julian's eyes met Soraya's across the crowded space. He had sought her out in her shadowy box. His gaze was not one of shared triumph, but of pure, unadulterated victory. It was a look that said, "See? This is all mine now. And you're nothing." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a dismissal, a final, silent severance. Soraya held his gaze for a long moment. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply looked back, her own eyes devoid of the fear or sadness he expected to see. She let him see nothing but a deep, still calm. Then, she gave him a single, slow nod in return. It was not a nod of submission. It was a signal. The performance was over. The real show was about to begin. The lights in the hall dimmed, leaving the rotating platform spotlit. Music swelled, a dramatic, orchestral piece of Julian's choosing. Isolde took her position on the central platform, which began to turn slowly, displaying the gown from every angle. The crowd erupted in applause. Soraya remained standing in the dark, her hand slipping into the small clutch she carried. Her fingers closed around a simple, unassuming remote. It was not for the lights or the music. It controlled the humidity and temperature regulators she had secretly had Kale install in the hall's ventilation system, pointed directly at the stage. She took a deep, steadying breath. The grand unveiling was complete. Now, it was time for the great unraveling. For a long, suspended moment, the hall was a cathedral of awe. Isolde, bathed in the incandescent spotlight, was the living embodiment of Ethel's promise. The gown seemed to defy physics, its shadowy folds and brilliant highlights creating an illusion of movement even as she stood perfectly still. The applause was thunderous, a wave of adulation that washed over the dais. Julian stood just off platform, his chest swelled with pride, his face a masterpiece of self-congratulation. This was his zenith. Soraya, from her shadowed balcony, watched the digital timer on her clutches lining. She had calculated the reaction time precisely. The environmental system needed a few minutes to saturate the air around the stage with a specific, warm humidity that was the crimson thread's undoing. 5 seconds. Isolde preened, turning her head to profile, ensuring every camera captured her best angle. 10 seconds. Julian caught Soraya's eye again, his smirk a final, silent dagger. She met it with the same unnerving calm. 15 seconds. It began with a whisper, a sound lost in the applause. A faint sigh of straining threads. On the liquid metal gown, the first to go was the shoulder seam. The delicate, silver-gilt weave, whose structural integrity depended entirely on the hidden crimson core, simply parted. It didn't tear, it dissolved. A long, graceful sleeve, no longer anchored, slid from the mannequin's shoulder and slumped to the platform like a shedding snakeskin. The applause faltered, replaced by a confused murmur. Then, the fool's gold jacket on its adjacent platform seemed to breathe out. The elaborate, metallic embroidery on the chest, a complex pattern of swirling vines, puckered and then sagged. The crimson threads woven through its centerline gave way, causing the entire front of the jacket to collapse inward as if it had been melted. The gold and silver threads, now unsupported, drooped into a tarnished, tangled mess. A woman in the front row gasped, pointing. The unraveling was not a violent rupture, but a quiet, inexorable decay. It was more horrifying for its grace. The whispering willow, tapestry, a monument to serene nature, began to weep. The great oak tree at its center, the heart of the composition, simply blurred. The rich browns and greens of the trunk and branches lost their definition, the threads slackening and separating. The entire central portion of the tapestry sagged forward, the forest scene collapsing into a formless, colorful stain against the backing cloth. No! Julian's cry was a strangled thing, cutting through the growing noise of the crowd. He stared, uncomprehending, as his legacy disintegrated before him. But the piece de resistance was Isolde. A low moan of stressed fabric whispered from her gown. She felt it before she saw it, a sudden looseness at her back, a draft where there should be none. She tried to turn, a flicker of panic in her eyes, but the movement was her undoing. The intricate latticework that held the gowns corseted back together, a design Julian had praised for its architectural genius, disintegrated. The crimson threads binding it vaporized under the warm, moist air. With a sound like a sigh, the entire back of Ethel's promise fell open. The fabric, its core support gone, went limp. The beautiful, structured silhouette melted away, the shoulders slipping down, the bodice sagging grotesquely. Isolde, her face a mask of dawning horror, clutched at the collapsing front of the gown, but it was like trying to hold water. The exquisite shadow and light fabric pooled around her ankles, leaving her standing in a puddle of ruined splendor, clad only in a sheer, embarrassing slip. The spotlight, once a beacon of triumph, was now a merciless interrogator, highlighting her humiliation for all to see. Her sharp, terrified scream finally broke the stunned silence of the hall. Chaos erupted. The crowd's murmur exploded into a cacophony of shouts, questions, and gasps. Camera flashes went off like a lightning storm, capturing every degrading detail. Journalists scrambled, speaking frantically into recorders. The elegant art show had become a circus of scandal. Julian stood frozen on the dais, his face a ghastly pale. He looked from the sagging tapestry to the slumped jacket, and finally to Isolde, who was now crouching, trying to gather the disintegrated fabric around her, sobbing with sheer mortification. His eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond professional ruin. This was impossible. This was witchcraft. His gaze shot up, searching the dark balcony. Soraya was no longer sitting. She stood at the railing, fully visible now in the ambient light reflecting from the chaos below. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply looked down at the wreckage, her expression one of cool, detached finality. She had pulled the thread, and the entire tapestry of their lives had come apart. She held up her clutch, not the remote, but her phone. With a single tap, she sent the pre-written, globally distributed email. The subject line, "The True Weaver, a statement of ownership and theft." Attached was the weaver's ledger. Every design, every process shot, every dated document. The tracked messages between Julian and Isolde. The financial records. The photographs from the apartment in the spire. The fabric of their deception had unraveled in a very literal, very public sense. Now, the digital evidence of their crime was flying through the ether, on its way to every news outlet, gallery, and investor in the city. The destruction was complete. The masterpiece was ruined. The masters were exposed. Soraya turned her back on the pandemonium and walked calmly towards the exit. The echoing screams and the frantic announcements over the hall's sound system were nothing but background noise. Her work here was done. The drive back to the estate was a silent, furious journey. Julian drove like a man possessed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight Soraya thought she could hear his teeth grinding. The hum of the luxury car's engine was the only sound, a stark contrast to the cacophony they had left behind. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. The rage emanating from him was a physical force, heating the confined space. Soraya sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the darkened cityscape blur past. She felt no fear, only a profound, weary anticipation. The public unraveling was over. Now came the private one. He didn't bother parking in the garage. He screeched to a halt at the front steps, the tires kicking up gravel. He was out of the car in an instant, slamming his door with a force that echoed in the night. He didn't hold the door for her. She followed him inside at her own pace, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a definitive thud that sounded like a tomb ceiling. The grand foyer was dimly lit, their shadows stretching long and distorted up the walls. Julian stood in the center of the marble floor, his back to her, his shoulders heaving. He spun around, and the mask was completely gone. The charming artist was replaced by a cornered animal, his eyes wild with a mixture of fury and utter confusion. "What did you do?" he snarled, the words ripped from his throat. "What in the hell did you do?" Soraya didn't answer immediately. She walked calmly to a side table and set her clutch down, the movement deliberate and unnervingly slow. "I finished the collection, Julian."
Just as you asked.
"You ruined me," he screamed, the sound raw and cracking. He gestured wildly towards the door, as if the scandal itself were chasing him. "You destroyed everything. My reputation. My career. That was deliberate."
How?
"A thread," she said, her voice flat and calm. "A special thread I developed. It doesn't like heat and moisture. A simple, chemical reaction. You really should have paid more attention to the materials I used." The simplicity of the answer seemed to infuriate him further. It was too mundane, too domestic a weapon for the scale of the destruction it had wrought. He took a step toward her, his hand twitching as if he wanted to strike her. "You vile, ungrateful witch. After everything I did for you, I gave you a purpose. I built a world for your little hobby." "You built a cage," she corrected, her gaze steady. "And you stole everything inside it. The designs, the credit, the money. You and Isolde." His face contorted. "Isolde has nothing to do with this. This is between you and me." "Is it?" Soraya's smile was a cold, thin curve. "Then why is half the money from our partnership in a Cayman Islands account with her name on it? Why did you have a wedding ceremony with her in your hometown 2 years ago?" Julian froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly, shocked white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The revelation was a physical blow, robbing him of his rage, replacing it with a dawning, sickening horror. She wasn't just a spurned wife. She was a prosecutor with evidence. How could you know that?" he whispered. "I know everything, Julian." She took a step forward now, her quiet voice filling the vast space. "I know about the apartment in the spire. I know about the sketches you sent her. I know you plan to use the master collection to finally push me out and install her as your true collaborator. You were going to take the money and the fame and leave me with nothing." She was backing him into a corner, not with physical threat, but with the relentless, crushing weight of the truth. "You're insane," he breathed, but the conviction was gone. It was a last desperate defense. "Am I?" Her eyes locked with his, and for the first time, she let him see the full, unbridled depth of her knowledge. The calm veneer cracked, not with hysteria, but with a chilling, ancient cold. Then tell me, Julian, in your plans for this glorious future with Isolde, what was your final solution for me? He stared, uncomprehending. You've already tried one after all, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any scream. In my studio, with the crimson silk scarf. The one you twisted so tight I could feel the threads cutting into my neck. Your last words were, "A masterpiece should be unique." You understand, don't you, my love? You've become a duplicate. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of the void. Julian's eyes widened in abject, soul-shattering terror. He staggered back a step, his hand flying to his own throat. He looked at her as if she were a ghost, a demon, something risen from a grave he thought was securely sealed. No, he choked out, his body trembling. That's not possible. It was a dream, a stress. It was murder, Soraya stated, the words clear and final as a judge's gavel. You murdered me for my art and my money. You killed me because I was an inconvenience. A loose thread. She looked at him, this broken, terrified man in the opulent foyer of the home he had bought with her stolen labor. The hatred she had carried for so long didn't vanish, but it transmuted into something else, a vast, consuming pity. He was so small. This life, she said, sweeping a hand around them, this second chance, it wasn't for you to succeed. It was for you to fail.
Publicly. Completely.
It was for me to show you that the hands you thought were just your tools could also build your prison. She picked up her clutch from the table. She had what she needed from this house. There was nothing left for her here. The police and the press will have all the evidence by now, she said, walking towards the door. The fraud, the embezzlement. I'd worry less about your career and more about your freedom. She paused at the threshold and looked back at him one last time. He was slumped against the banister, a hollowed-out shell, his face buried in his hands. Enjoy the masterpiece, Julian, she whispered. I know I will. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the clean, cool night air, leaving the ghost of her past life weeping on the marble floor. The world did not simply move on. It devoured the scandal with insatiable appetite. Soraya did not need to seek refuge in a remote location. Instead, she checked into a sleek, modern hotel in the heart of Iridia under the name of her new company, Phoenix Holdings. From her high-floor suite, she watched the city lights glitter like a field of fallen stars. She was at the center of the storm, and the calm was entirely her own. The Weaver's ledger and its accompanying evidence had landed not with a whisper, but with the force of a tectonic shift. The story was too salacious to ignore. The reclusive genius, the plagiarizing husband, the treacherous muse, the secret marriage, the embezzled funds, and the spectacular, public destruction of the fraudulent collection. It was a perfect narrative storm. Her lawyer, a sharp, unflappable woman named Ms. Thorne, managed the deluge. The fraud case is airtight, she stated during their first meeting, her tablet displaying a cascade of emails and legal filings. The embezzlement charges are proceeding. The gallery and the investors are suing Julian for the entirety of their advances, plus damages for reputational harm. He is financially and professionally obliterated. Soraya listened, her gaze occasionally drifting to the television, which was muted but showed endless loops of the Ethelgard unraveling, as the press had dubbed it. She saw Isolde's horrified face, Julian's stunned paralysis, frozen in time. Isolde, Soraya asked, her voice devoid of malice, merely curious. Facing her own set of problems, Ms. Thorne replied with a thin, professional smile. Receiving stolen intellectual property, conspiracy to commit fraud. Her reputation is ash. The fashion houses have dropped her. She's toxic. Meanwhile, Phoenix Holdings, with Soraya as its sole and very public owner, began to quietly acquire the salvageable assets of the collapsed venture. The brand name, the client list, the studio equipment, all were purchased for pennies on the dollar from the bankruptcy trustees. It was a cold, clinical devouring of the corpse. But the true final stitch in the tapestry of their ruin was applied not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. Soraya, through her lawyer, released one more piece of evidence to a select, investigative journalist. The audio recording. It was from the hidden camera Kale had installed in the foyer of the estate. The footage was dark, but the audio was crystal clear. Julian's enraged screams, his admission of building a world for her little hobby, and most damningly, Soraya's calm, chilling recounting of her own murder in a previous life, followed by Julian's stunned, terrified silence. The audio cut off before her final words, leaving the listener with the horrifying implication that Julian's silence was a confession to something too monstrous to name. The public, which had been fascinated by the scandal, was now revolted. The story was no longer about art theft. It was about a profound, psychological predation. Julian was no longer just a fraud. He was a monster. Isolde was no longer just a mistress. She was the accomplice to a man capable of, at the very least, fantasizing about his wife's murder. The final confrontation happened not with Soraya, but between the two architects of her misery. Driven by a desperation she had never known, Julian went to Isolde's apartment at the Spire. He found it in disarray, suitcases open, valuables missing. Isolde was frantically packing, her face, once a mask of perfect composure, now blotchy with tears and tight with panic. "You," he snarled from the doorway, his voice ragged. "This is your fault. Your greed, your constant pushing." Isolde spun around, a jeweled box in her hand. "My fault," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You were the genius. You were the one who said it was foolproof. You couldn't even control your own pathetic wife." She knew about the ceremony, Isolde. She knew about everything. "How? How do you think, you idiot?" Isolde laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "I told her. Not directly, of course. I sent her an anonymous letter months ago. I thought it would make her leave.
I didn't know she was
A spider, waiting to weave us into her web." Julian stared at her, the betrayal so complete it was almost sublime. His partner, his lover, had been the one to inadvertently spring the trap. The sheer, stupid irony of it hollowed him out. "You ruined me," he whispered, the fight gone out of him. "You ruined us both," she cried, throwing the jeweled box at him. It missed and shattered against the doorframe, scattering cheap glass baubles. "I'm not going to jail for you, Julian. I'm leaving. I've still got the access codes to the Cayman account. What's left of it after the lawyers and fines." His head snapped up. "You wouldn't." "It's already done," she spat, her eyes gleaming with a feral light. "Call it my severance package. For services rendered." She zipped the last suitcase closed and tried to push past him. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "You're not taking my money." "It's not yours," she yelled, struggling against him. "It was never yours. It was always hers. We were just the thieves. And we were terrible at it." They struggled, a bitter, graceless dance in the doorway of the apartment that had been their sanctuary. It was a far cry from the elegant conspirators they had once been. They were just two desperate animals in a hole of their own digging, turning on each other with the last of their strength. Isolde finally wrenched herself free, leaving him clutching a handful of the expensive, knout-horn fabric of her sleeve. She didn't look back, dragging her suitcase down the hall, the sound of its wheels a frantic, receding echo. Julian sank to his knees amidst the scattered glass, alone in the ruins of their shared ambition. The legal battles, the financial ruin, the public hatred. It was all a descending avalanche. But this, the final, selfish betrayal from the woman for whom he had sacrificed everything, was the stone that broke his spine. The trap was not just sprung, it was empty. Soraya had taken back her art, her money, and her life. And in doing so, she had left them with nothing but each other's contempt, a currency that was now utterly worthless. The final stitch was in. The pattern of their destruction was complete. The silence in the lawyer's office was a palpable thing, thick and heavy with finality.
Ms.
Thorne slid a single, weighty document across the polished mahogany desk. "It's done," she said, her voice crisp and efficient. "The divorce is finalized. All terms. The estate, the remaining business assets, what little wasn't seized by creditors or purchased by Phoenix Holdings, are officially yours, free and clear." Julian waived all contestation. Soraya looked down at the paper. Her signature, a confident slash of ink, was beside Julian's, a shaky, spidery scrawl that spoke of a broken man. It was not just a legal document. It was the severance of a life, the official end of a story that had ended in murder long before this moment. She felt no triumph, only a vast, quiet emptiness, like a room that had been cleared of toxic clutter. "And the criminal case?" Soraya asked, her voice even. The embezzlement and fraud charges were too substantial to ignore. He was indicted on multiple counts. Given the overwhelming evidence, his lawyers are pushing for a plea bargain.
He will serve time. Ms.
Thorne adjusted her glasses. Isolde, in a bid for leniency, provided testimony against him. She received probation and a lifetime of obscurity. Soraya gave a slow nod. It was a fitting end. Not a dramatic, violent downfall, but a slow, grinding, legal erasure. Julian would not be a martyr. He would be a case file, a cautionary tale in business law. Isolde would not be a tragic muse. She would be a footnote, a faded photograph from a forgotten scandal. She stood, the document in her hand feeling no heavier than a single skein of silk.
Thank you, Ms. Thorne, for everything.
It was my professional privilege, Ms. Ethel, the lawyer replied, using the name Soraya had reclaimed, her mother's maiden name, a name untainted by Julian's touch. Stepping out of the cool, air-conditioned office and into the vibrant pulse of the city, Soraya felt the sun on her face. It was different now. The light did not filter through the gilded bars of a cage. It fell upon her freely. She was just a woman on a street, anonymous and unburdened. She walked to the new headquarters of Phoenix Holdings. It was a bright, airy loft space in a converted factory, a world away from the cloistered opulence of the estate. The walls were white, the floors pale wood. Sunlight streamed through massive windows, illuminating the new looms, the racks of raw, beautiful materials, the bustling, quiet energy of her small, dedicated team. This was not a sanctuary hidden from the world. It was a workshop engaged with it. Her first collection under the Phoenix label was not about revenge or hidden messages. It was about texture, light, and resilience. The pieces were strong yet delicate, complex yet honest. There were no hidden threads, no secret weaknesses. They were what they were, and the critics, once so eager to dissect her personal life, were now forced to confront only the work. And the work was extraordinary. One evening, as she was locking up the studio, her phone vibrated. It was an unknown number, but a cold intuition told her who it was. She answered, saying nothing. For a moment, there was only ragged breathing on the other end. Then, a voice, cracked and thin, stripped of all its former honeyed charm, whispered, "Soraya?" It was Julian. She didn't hang up. She listened, a curator preserving a specimen of utter defeat. They took everything," he croaked. "The house. The money. My name, it's mud. It's a joke." He let out a wet, shuddering sound that might have been a sob. "Isolde, she's gone. Took the last of the money, and left. She calls me a worthless cripple. A hollow man." Soraya remained silent, her gaze fixed on the city lights beginning to twinkle in the deepening twilight. "Why," he begged, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you stop me? In that other life, you stopped me. We were happy. We had a life. Why did you let me destroy it all?" The question hung in the digital space between them, a final, desperate attempt to shift the blame, to make himself the victim of her inaction. Finally, Soraya spoke, her voice soft but absolute, leaving no room for argument or pity. "You made your choice, Julian. In both lives. You chose greed. You chose her. You chose to destroy me. This time, I simply chose not to stand in your way." She paused, letting the truth settle like dust. "Enjoy the life you built for yourself. You and Isolde earned it." She ended the call without another word and blocked the number. There was no anger left, no satisfaction. There was only the quiet understanding that some patterns, once woven, cannot be undone. They can only be cut away and a new weave begun on a fresh, clean loom. He was a ghost from a bad dream, and the dawn had finally come. A year to the day after the Ethelgard unraveling, the Viridia Museum of Modern Art opened its doors to a new exhibition, Renewal, the Phoenix Collection by Soraya Ethel. There were no dramatic reveals, no hidden traps, no venom woven into the threads. This was not an act of revenge, but a reclamation. The collection was a love letter to resilience, a symphony of texture and light that spoke of healing and strength. The pieces were breathtaking. A cloak woven from silk and spun glass, fragile yet impenetrable. A tapestry that depicted a forest after a fire, with new growth emerging vibrant and determined from the charred earth. A gown the color of a dawn sky, embroidered with a pattern that mimicked the delicate, repairing veins of a cracked leaf. It was art that acknowledged brokenness, but celebrated the repair, the scar tissue that was often stronger than the original skin. Soraya moved through the gallery, not as a hidden specter, but as the acknowledged artist. She wore a simple, elegantly cut dress of her own design, a deep forest green that brought out the calm in her eyes. She accepted compliments with a genuine, quiet grace, discussed her techniques with curators, and even shared a laugh with a critic who had once penned scathing reviews of Julian's work. She was no longer the reclusive wife or the vengeful artist. She was Soraya Ethel, a master of her craft. The past had been acknowledged, but it did not define her. It was a color she had used in her palette, nothing more. As the crowd thinned, a young woman approached her, clutching a program tightly in her hands. She had wide, earnest eyes and an air of nervous admiration.
Ms.
Ethel, the woman began, her voice barely a whisper. Your work. It's like you reached into my soul and wove what you found there. Soraya smiled, a real, warm smile that reached her eyes. Thank you. That's the highest compliment an artist can receive. My name is Alara, the woman said, gathering courage. I was in a situation. Not the same as yours, but a cage, nonetheless. A relationship that was slowly erasing me. Seeing what you did, your strength. It gave me the courage to leave, to start my own Phoenix Holdings in a way. Soraya listened, a profound sense of completion settling over her. This was the true purpose of her second chance. It was not just to punish the wicked, but to inspire the broken. Her story was no longer just about Julian and Isolde. It was a thread in a larger tapestry of survival. You are the architect of your own life, Alara, Soraya said, her voice firm yet kind. Never forget that. The loom is yours. You choose the pattern. The young woman's eyes glistened with tears of gratitude before she nodded and melted back into the crowd, clutching the program like a talisman. Later that night, back in her light-filled apartment overlooking the city, Soraya received a final message. It was from Kale, her discreet investigator. It contained no text, only a link to a small, local news article from a distant, sleepy town. The headline was brief: Disgraced artist found deceased. The article stated that Julian, having served a short, harsh sentence and released to a life of penniless obscurity, had been found in a rented room. The official cause was listed as an overdose of cheap alcohol and prescription painkillers. The article was 3 paragraphs long. There was no mention of his former glory, no retrospective of his work. It was an administrative notice of an ended life. Isolde, the article noted, could not be reached for comment. Soraya read it once, then closed the link. She felt a quiet, sorrowful pang, not for the man he became, but for the terrible waste of it all. The potential, however flawed, that had been squandered on greed and a desperate need for adulation. He had chosen a path of glittering lies, and it had led him to a lonely, anonymous room. It was the final, sad stitch in his story. She walked to her personal loom, a small, beautiful thing set up by her largest window. On it was a new, private project, something just for her. It was a simple, abstract piece, woven in shades of silver, blue, and the soft, warm gold of a morning sun. It was not for an exhibition or a client. It was a meditation, a promise to herself. As her fingers began to move, guiding the shuttle through the warp, she thought not of the past, but of the future. The rhythm of the loom was a heartbeat, steady and sure. Each pass of the weft was a new moment, a new choice. The threads of her life had been tangled, cut, and burned. But from the ashes, she had gathered them again. She had chosen her colors with care. She had stretched a new warp of resilience, and she was now weaving a weft of peace. The embroidered dawn of her new life was no longer just breaking. It was here, bright and full of possibility. And she, Soraya Ethel, was the weaver, finally and forever, free. 5 years later, the Soraya Ethel Textile Arts Center opened in a renovated Riverside warehouse. It was not a gallery for the elite, but a vibrant, humming community space. Sunlight poured through the high windows onto work tables where aspiring artists, funded by the Phoenix Foundation Scholarship Program, worked alongside master weavers. The air buzzed with the sounds of looms, laughter, and the quiet, intense focus of creation. Soraya, now in her early 30s, moved through the space with an air of quiet authority that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with hard-won peace. She stopped to help a young student untangle a complex warp, her fingers deft and patient. She discussed the molecular structure of a new plant-based dye with a visiting chemist. This was her world now, built not on the ashes of revenge, but on the foundation of a passion she had reclaimed. A familiar figure stood by the entrance, watching her with a calm smile. Kale, no longer just a discreet consultant, but the head of security for her growing enterprise, gave her a slight nod. The shadows of their first meeting in a tea shop were long gone, replaced by a deep, mutual respect. "Everything is secure, Soraya," he said as she approached. "And there's a package for you. Personal delivery." He gestured to a small, intricately carved wooden box sitting on the reception desk. There was no return address. Soraya felt no apprehension, only a faint curiosity. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of raw silk, was a single, perfect spool of thread. It was not her crimson silk, but a new, incredible material. It seemed to be woven from light itself, shifting in color from silver to gold as it caught the sun. A small, handwritten note accompanied it. Asterisk, "They say you can't spin straw into gold. I disagree. I've spent the last 5 years trying to create a thread worthy of your hands. This one is unbreakable. It's called Ethel Weave. Consider it a tribute from an admirer who has followed your rise from the shadows. Your story proved that the most beautiful tapestries are often woven from the most broken threads." Asterisk, it was unsigned. Soraya ran the thread through her fingers. It was cool and impossibly strong. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was not a declaration of love, but something far more meaningful, a recognition from a peer, an acknowledgement of her craft from someone who understood its language. Later that evening, she sat in her private office at the center, the spool of Ethel Weave on her desk. On the wall across from her hung a single, small piece from the Phoenix collection, the first one she had woven after the divorce, a simple composition of interlocking silver and blue lines that represented the strength found in connection. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alara, the young woman she had met at her exhibition years ago. A photo came through, a bright, messy studio, with a loom holding a half-finished, brilliantly colored tapestry. The message read, asterisk, "My first commission. Thank you for showing me that the loom is mine." Asterisk, Soraya's heart felt full. This was the legacy that mattered. Not the ruin of Julian and Isolde, which was now a faded, tragic footnote from another lifetime. But this. The threads of inspiration, of courage, passed on to another, and another, creating a pattern that would continue long after she was gone. She looked from the glowing thread on her desk to the vibrant photo on her phone, and finally, to the serene tapestry on her wall. Every thread of her life, the dark, the bloody, the golden, and the new, had been integral. They had not broken her. They had, in fact, made the final weave infinitely stronger. The story of the crimson thread was over, its purpose served. But the weaving itself was eternal. She picked up the spool of Ethel Weave, feeling its potential. There were always new patterns to discover, new fabrics to create. The unbroken thread was not the one in her hand. It was the one that ran through her spirit. And it was just beginning.